Hey everybody, I wanted to just take a minute and comment on the recent announcement that development has ceased on the free-to-play multiplayer PvP game NOSGOTH, and that the game will be getting taken down from Steam and servers will be going offline on May 31st, 2016. Now, for those who aren't aware of NOSGOTH, it is an asymmetrical vampires versus humans free-to-play PvP game where teams of 4 players, or in some game modes 5 players, face off in arena combat against each other in the Legacy of Kain universe of NOSGOTH. Now, the Legacy of Kain franchise hadn't been touched for several years before this, and all of the previous Legacy of Kain games were generally single-player, story-driven, third-person action, adventure, and puzzle games that were really, in my opinion, some of the most fantastic first-person experiences, or single-player experiences, rather, that I have ever had the pleasure of playing. The game's storyline and narrative were its strong points, and NOSGOTH the game sort of threw this out the window a little bit in order to focus more on a multiplayer mode, something that had never been attempted in the Legacy of Kain franchise. On April 8th, the NOSGOTH dev team posted a blog post on nosgoth.com called "A Farewell to Arms, NOSGOTH's Final Days Are Upon Us," stating, "It is with great regret that today we can confirm that the development for NOSGOTH has officially ceased and we are winding down support for the game. Between now and 31st May 2016, NOSGOTH will remain available to play, after which the game will go offline. On behalf of the entire NOSGOTH team, we want to thank the community for all their feedback, support, and dedication to the game during the closed and open beta phases. It's been a pleasure to build this game with your help, but ultimately its audience hadn't grown enough to sustain ongoing operations." Officially, it sounds like the reason for NOSGOTH's cessation of development and cancellation is a loss of the player base that was supporting it, and therefore the executive teams at Square Enix must have decided that since there aren't enough players on the game is no longer worth the investment, and therefore they are going to cancel it. Another news article had stated that any future Legacy of Kain titles would still be judged on their own merit, and as if to indicate that this is not the death of the franchise. Now, I am a huge Legacy of Kain fan. I consider it to be one of the best franchises in video games that I've ever played. So when I heard about NOSGOTH, I was extremely excited. I signed up and was selected for the closed alpha pool, and I continue to be active in the game through the closed beta and all the way up through the open beta, which is the most recent phase of the game. I've been playing even up to the recent Beastmaster update, so I've had plenty of time on it. I even purchased the old version of the Immortal Founder Pack, which I believe was around $120, and I did that not so much to gain the rewards from it, but purely to support Psyonix and Square Enix, and to let them know with my money that I wanted to see the Legacy of Kain franchise continue. So let's start out with what they got right. First of all, I think that the art direction in NOSGOTH was fantastic. The designs for the vampires were reasonably consistent with the designs of the same vampire clans in Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. They looked believably between a sort of human vampire phase and the evolved monsters that they became in the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver game. It was also really interesting to see them fill in the history of the Razialim and get to see them, because by the time you get to Soul Reaver 1, they're extinct. They've been hunted down. And so the idea of them bringing in lore to backfill holes in the original plot is fantastic. I think they did a great job of it. So they got the lore pretty right. They got the graphics right. I think the idea of bringing in one of the original Soul Reaver 1 artists to design the evolved forms of the vampires was a fantastic design choice. And I think that the human art was really good. Many of the human classes were also grounded well in the lore. The hunter was definitely, the whole Iron Guard concept was definitely well-fitting within the lore. The Scout was well-fitting, mentioning Dark Eden. The Alchemist was mentioning the Sisters of Anacroth. So you have a lot of old Blood Omen 1 lore in this game. And then you have the Prophet, which is a nod to Avernus Cathedral and a nod to the Hilden, of all things. So the only classes that didn't really fit the lore were the the Drowning Man Vanguard and the new Beastmaster, and they didn't feel completely out of place. It sort of made sense. I was willing to accept it. So I think that their art direction and their lore direction was spot on. As a hardcore Legacy of Kain fan, I can give them a nod. I think they did a good job. I think they were aware of the IP that they were working within, and I think that they did it a reasonable amount of justice. Some hardcore fans may disagree with me. That's okay. They didn't get everything right, so I will grant you that. But they got enough right that I was able to accept it. Similarly, I found the setting of the game, which takes place in between the beginning intro cinematic of Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, where Raziel the Vampire is thrown down into the abyss, and then the second part of the cinematic where he is resurrected as a wraith. The game backfills that storyline with a war between the leaderless vampire clans after Kain has disappeared, and the resurgent humans who are, basically arming themselves and scratching out a resistance against the vampires. I think that setting worked really well because basically they had to come up with a story reason for this game to make sense as a multiplayer combat game in an IP that has a history of being a single-player, story-driven narrative. So I think a lot of care was given to that, and they did a really good job with grounding the series within a very difficult to manage existing lore, and I give the development team a lot of credit for that because it was not easy to do, and I know people like me were scrutinizing the hell out of them because this was our beloved franchise being brought back in a way that we did not expect it to. So props to be given to them. Nice job, guys. I'd also like to give a nod to the mechanics of the gameplay. An asymmetrical PvP game is not easy to pull off. A lot of games like Left 4 Dead would pull it off by allowing one team to do sort of a horde mode while the other team is a little bit more survivable. But in this game, it's sort of equal. In fact, if anything, the vampires individually are a little bit stronger, which emphasized a lot of teamwork on the human side. Initially, it felt kind of imbalanced. I mean, vampires can climb up walls, their melee attacks hurt a lot, but ultimately, I think that the balance was on the forefront of the developers' minds throughout the game. I think they did a good job of it. I think that the method of having abilities in the game that were sort of not upgrades, but side grades, was a good philosophy to follow. And as the game basically wore on in its development cycle and certain things were tightened up, I thought that the gameplay only improved over time. Also, the map design I thought was very good. The maps looked like they made sense within the Legacy of Kain universe. I was able to sort of place the locations of certain maps with certain locales in Nosgoth. I've got to say it was kind of cool to see a destroyed city map that harkened back to Meridian from Blood Omen 2, rather. So yeah, I've got to say, good map design. The vampire maps in particular, the Fane and the Crucible and the Cathedral map, the most recently released Cathedral map for the Zephonim, all of those were well grounded in lore. They made excellent use of vampire imagery. I mean, hell, they even made a statue of Raziel, which I thought was really well done. So all in all, graphically, the game was amazing. Gameplay-wise, the game was pretty good. Unfortunately, that's where the praise kind of has to end. So let's get into the bad. And the bad can really be focused in one area. The back end of this game, the mechanics of the engine in which this game did matchmaking, did a friend system, did a teamwork system. It was basically garbage from the word go. All of the game's bugs, nearly all of the game's bugs that I encountered were in the matchmaking system and in the basically net code and network connectivity of the game. I spent months not able to even participate in the game's much vaunted league system, even though I really wanted to, because of problems with the net code and problems with connectivity to the servers and with profile syncing. games would get dropped right off the bat, through the alpha and through the beta. There would be situations where 8 players would connect to a game, but it would be 3 on one side and 5 on the other side. It was unfortunately a very, very common occurrence for back-end bugs to occur in this game, and they hampered the gameplay and drove players away. Even up until recently, I was trying to get a new player, a friend of mine. If you've watched the series or watched my streaming, you know 21st Century Fool. Noxloopy and I were trying to introduce him to the game, and we couldn't get him into a match because we couldn't get him in a team with us. And that's inexcusable. If you can't play a game like this with your friends, it wears out on you really, really quickly. And that kind of occurrence had happened in the past. I had problems with my profile syncing. I had problems with experience being applied properly. At one point, I got completely de-leveled back down to 0, even though my progress ultimately was not lost and I was able to resync my profile. These are all things that drive away a player base, which is what NOSGOTH's developers are claiming is the reason for the game's cessation of development. So if the reason for ceasing development on the game is that your player base did not remain, but you actively drove your player base away by not addressing bugs in your networking and your netcode and your matchmaking system, I mean, is it really the fault of a player base to move on to a more stable game where they can enjoy the player versus player combat experience over staying loyal to your game, which is buggy and drops people from matches and puts people in asymmetrical matches, not from a gameplay perspective, but from a player perspective on a regular basis, and most importantly, a game in which you cannot invite your friend to a party and play. Also, in the most recent updates to the game, in particular, the new Beastmaster update to the game, Square Enix decided to try to break away from Steam for the multiplayer aspect of their game. They released a launcher for NOSGOTH that was separate from Steam, and they implemented a separate friend system and, I'm assuming, matchmaking system. This was probably the death blow to your own game, Square Enix, because that matchmaking system and friend system and that launcher were all cumbersome and buggy as hell. The launcher, for just on a anecdotal note, if your launcher does not automatically close itself after someone exits the game, and the player has to manually go on their computer into their taskbar and close the launcher in order to not have it running in the background of their computer, that is a bad launcher, in my opinion. It shouldn't be a requirement to go in and remove the launcher from active processes manually. Good programs should clean themselves up if they're not required to be running in the background all the time. And a game does not need to be running in the background when you're not playing it. Now, that kind of thing I would have been able to deal with if it weren't for the fact that once you get into the game, the matchmaking system would not allow you to get a team going. So that really was the death knell of the game. As I mentioned before, if you can't play with friends, why would you want to play? The implementation of that third-party launcher alongside the matchmaking system and the third-party friends list, in my mind, was wholly unnecessary, and once they implemented that, the entire game fell apart. Nobody could really get a match easily. I noticed more and more players were dropping from the game. People would be sitting in lobbies for, 10, 15, 30 minutes, an hour, waiting for a game to go because you couldn't keep your player base because they kept getting disconnected or having, bugs and problems with the matchmaking. Or even if everything did work, you would end up match made in a room that had vastly superior players, which is kind of like a more minor problem that people gripe about a little bit more commonly. It's kind of reality. It just happens. But at that point, people are getting discouraged. You've already given them reasons to not want to play your game, and they're eventually just going to leave and go looking for greener pastures and games that are more player-friendly, have larger player bases, and run better. Now, I was not one of the players that participated regularly in the forums, and I guess that makes me a bad alpha and beta tester that I didn't regularly report on too many of these bugs. However, from a quick look over the forums, it seems like several members of the community who were highly active were angry about the fact that they had been submitting feedback and bug reports about the game the entire time the game was running, and a lot of their feedback was ignored by the development team. Now, I imagine that this team is different from the team that was actually developing the game and the art and the mechanical engine of playing the game, because I think those people definitely did a good job. But the people who were supposed to be squashing bugs, the people who are supposed to be listening to player feedback, it sounds like they didn't. And I can't say that from personal experience because I didn't really interact with that side of the game very often. I didn't interact with the dev team reporting bugs very often. But it seems like nobody listened, and it seems like this could have been avoided. And it seems like when you just ignore your player base completely, they're going to leave. Your player base is what keeps the game going. Speaking as a musician, you're nothing without your fans. If your fans are not supporting you, are not, participating in your project and interacting with what you've put out, this is what happens to you. Ultimately, I would say that NOSGOTH was a good game, and it had the potential to be a great game, but it had its legs tied up by a constant stream of bugs, mostly having to do with the game's back-end networking. And ultimately, that combined with a perceived lack of listening to the community when they supplied bug reports and feedback, that's what drove this game down. Officially, Square Enix wants to say that the player base did not sustain the game, but the onus is on a developer to hold a player base. If you do not develop a game that runs well, is interesting and fun to play, and creates memorable moments for the people playing it and enthusiasm to continue, your game is going to fail, especially if you are relying on a freemium, free-to-play but pay-to-get cosmetic upgrades system in order to sustain yourself and in order to sustain your servers. If you are going to do that kind of system, you need to have a massive player base that is passionate about the game and enjoys it. And if you do not cater to that player base, and most importantly, if you don't make your game run smoothly and easily and so that you don't have to think about it and you can just go in and hit the ladder and beat people up and have fun, if that's not your game, you will not sustain a free-to-play player base. So ultimately, losing your player base, you have no one to blame but yourselves, Square Enix, and it's a real shame because you definitely had something great here that could have been even better if you had invested the time and resources into it, and if you had handled your back end a little better. Not even the gameplay. The gameplay was there. The gameplay was solid. It's not the most fantastic PvP game I've ever played, but it's damn good. And I've had a lot of amazing moments in games and had a lot of fun with it. And I'm going to be sad to see it go. So, again, hats off to the development team of the game itself. I think you guys did a killer job, and I'm sad to see the development of your back-end network basically bola your legs and bring you crashing to the ground because you had something really good, and it could have been way better. Anyway, that's my thoughts on NOSGOTH. I will probably be playing the game all the way up to the termination point of May 31st, as long as I can find matches. If you liked this video, please hit the like button or hit the dislike button if you disagree with me. That's fine too. Let me know what you think in the comments section if you played NOSGOTH. Let me know how you feel about the game being canceled or if you agree or disagree with any of my points. I will be sure to try and get back to you if you do respond. And if you like my video content, please hit that subscribe button. And I appreciate you watching. We'll see you next time.